The frost had painted delicate patterns across the windows of the east wing by the time Eleanor Ashworth set down her embroidery and admitted to herself that her fingers had grown too numb to continue. March 15th, 1814. And still winter. Winter clung to Ravenscroft House with the same stubborn persistence that characterized everything about her marriage. She rose from the chair positioned nearest the dying fire and crossed to add another log, though she knew the effort would prove futile. The east wing was always cold, had been cold for the 2 years since Frederick had quietly suggested she might prefer her own chambers, and no amount of burning wood could chase away the particular chill that had settled into Eleanor's bones. Her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the fading light as she bent toward the hearth, those small treasures from her old life, before she became the Duchess of Ravenscroft in name and nothing else. At 24, she had mastered the art of invisibility, had learned to move through the grand halls of this house like a ghost haunting rooms that had never truly welcomed her. The clock on the mantel showed 7 in the evening, which meant Frederick would be settling into dinner at Lady Montague's estate by now, his evening coat pressed and perfect, his conversation flowing with the ease he never showed his own wife. Eleanor straightened and caught her reflection in the darkened window, a pale woman in a sensible grey dress, unremarkable in every way that mattered to society, and apparently to the man who had married her for her substantial dowry 3 years ago. She had not heard him say her Christian name in months. The sound of whispered voices drifted up from the corridor below, and Eleanor found herself moving toward her chamber door without conscious decision, drawn by the particular tone that servants adopted when discussing their betters. She paused with her hand on the cold brass handle, listening as 2 housemaids passed below. "His Grace looked particularly fine tonight," one murmured, and the other responded with knowing emphasis that Lady Montague certainly thought so, that everyone knew the widow had secured the Duke's attention long ago, that it was a wonder the Duchess bore it with such dignity. Eleanor closed her eyes against the familiar pain that was no longer quite pain, but rather a hollow ache, the space where hope had once lived before Frederick's polite indifference had slowly suffocated it. She returned to her writing desk, where an unopened letter from Philip Sinclair sat waiting, his familiar handwriting a reminder of the life she might have had if her father had valued love over connections. Outside, freezing rain began to tap against the windows, and Eleanor stood motionless in her cold and silent room, something shifting inside her chest. For 3 years she had been the perfect Duchess, quiet and compliant and utterly alone. For 3 years she had accepted her husband's coldness as her due, convinced herself that wanting more was foolish. Tonight, listening to servants pity her while her husband dined with his mistress, Eleanor felt the last thread of her careful resignation begin to fray, and with it came a desperate and dangerous thought. The knock came at precisely 9 in the evening, startling Eleanor from the dark reverie that had held her motionless at her writing desk for the better part of 2 hours. Philip's unopened letter still clutched in fingers that had grown stiff with cold and indecision. The storm had intensified since she had overheard the servants' whispered pity. Freezing rain transformed to sheets of water that lashed against the windows with such violence that Eleanor had not heard the approaching hoof-beats or the commotion at the front entrance. And so when her chamber door opened to reveal a footman announcing the Earl of Sinclair, she rose with her heart hammering against her ribs and her thoughts scattered like leaves in a gale. Philip stood in the doorway moments later, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his greatcoat dripping onto the polished floor, and his grey eyes holding that particular expression of tender concern that had been Eleanor's undoing since they were children playing in her father's garden, before dowries and dukes and the slow death of girlish dreams. "You did not answer my letters," he said simply, "and I could not bear another week of wondering if you were well." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest at the sight of him. This man who had loved her quietly and completely since she was 16, who had stood silent at her wedding because her father had deemed an earl insufficient when a duke had offered, who had written faithfully every month for 3 years, asking nothing but whether she was happy, though they both knew the answer. She crossed the room without conscious thought, and took his cold hands in hers, propriety forgotten in the overwhelming relief of being seen by someone who actually wished to look. "The servants noted your arrival in the household ledger?" she heard herself say, her voice strange and distant, and Philip's brow furrowed at the odd observation. "Frederick returns at midnight," she continued, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He dines with his mistress every week and returns precisely at midnight, and I know this because I have counted the hours of my abandonment so many times that I could recite his schedule like a prayer." Philip's hands tightened around hers, and she watched the understanding dawn in his eyes, followed swiftly by something that looked like grief. He drew her to the settee by the dying fire and sat beside her, close enough that she could smell rain and horses and the faint tobacco that had always clung to his coat, and Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that she had not been this close to another person in months, that Frederick had not touched her, except by accident since the awkward and dutiful wedding night that had produced no heir and seemed to have extinguished whatever minimal interest her husband had possessed. "Tell me," Philip said quietly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Tell me everything." And Eleanor looked into the face of the man she might have married and felt the last of her careful control begin to crumble. The sherry had been a mistake, Eleanor knew, watching the amber liquid tremble in her glass as thunder shook the windows and the candles burned ever lower in their holders. But the warmth spreading through her chest was the first she had felt in months, perhaps years, and she found she could not bring herself to regret it. The clock showed 10:30, which meant 90 minutes remained before Frederick's carriage would roll up the drive. 90 minutes in which she sat beside Philip on the settee in her private sitting room while the storm raged at its peak outside and something equally turbulent built within her breast. "He has never truly been my husband," she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could catch them, and Philip's sharp intake of breath told her he understood her meaning. The wedding night had been brief and dutiful and filled with apologies, Frederick turning away almost immediately afterward, and in 3 years there had been perhaps a handful of similar encounters, each more distant than the last, until he had suggested separate chambers, and Eleanor had understood that even that minimal connection had become too much for him to bear. Philip set down his own glass and took her trembling hands in his grey eyes dark with something that might have been fury or grief or both. "He never deserved you," Philip said quietly. "I should have fought for you. I should have refused to let your father sell you to a man who would treat you as furniture," and Eleanor felt tears she had not permitted herself in years begin to track down her cheeks. The sherry made her bold, the loneliness made her reckless, and the 3 years of invisible suffering made her desperate enough to voice the terrible idea that had been forming since she had overheard the servant's whispered pity. "What if he found us?" she whispered, and watched Philip's expression shift from confusion to shock, to reluctant understanding. "What if for once in 3 years he was forced to see me, to feel something, even if that something is anger?" Philip pulled back, his honourable nature warring visibly with his love for her, but Eleanor pressed forward, her voice cracking as she explained. "Nothing would happen between them, nothing real. But if Frederick returned to find them in a compromising position, if for one moment he had to confront the possibility that his invisible wife had been seen and wanted by another man, perhaps then he would finally look at her." Philip's resistance crumbled as she spoke of her loneliness, of the nights spent counting the hours until Frederick returned smelling of another woman's perfume, of the slow death of every hope she had carried into her marriage. "I failed you once," Philip said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I will not fail you again, even if this is madness, even if it ruins us both." Eleanor's hands shook as she gripped his, but beneath the terror she felt something stirring that had been dormant for 3 long years, and she recognized it with a start as the faintest flicker of power. The bedchamber felt foreign to Eleanor as she stood in its center at midnight, transformed from the cold and lonely space where she had spent so many sleepless nights into something that felt like a stage awaiting its final act, the single candle on the nightstand casting wavering shadows across walls that seemed to press closer with each passing moment as the storm outside began its slow retreat into distant rumbles and weakening gusts. Philip had removed his coat and cravat, both items folded with military precision on the chair by the window, and he stood now in his shirt-sleeves with his back against the bedpost, looking so profoundly uncomfortable that Eleanor might have laughed under any other circumstances, but laughter was as foreign to her in this moment as the racing of her own heart, which hammered so violently against her ribs that she felt certain he must hear it across the room. She had changed into her nightgown behind the screen, her fingers fumbling with buttons and ribbons as she shed the day dress that had become her armor. And when she emerged, she saw Philip's eyes widen before he quickly looked away, his honor fighting against the intimacy of the scene they were creating. Her hair was unpinned for the first time in Philip's presence, the dark waves tumbling past her shoulders in a way that Frederick had never seen because he had never come to her chamber at night, never stayed long enough to watch her let down the careful arrangements that society demanded, and Eleanor felt strangely vulnerable in this small detail, more than in the thin fabric of her nightgown or the unlocked door that stood between them and discovery. "The carriage," Philip said suddenly, his voice tight, and Eleanor heard it too, the distant sound of wheels on gravel and horses being brought to a halt, and her breath caught in her throat as reality crashed through the haze of sherry and desperation that had carried her this far. She moved to the bed and sat on its edge, arranging herself in a pose that suggested intimacy without crossing the final line, and Philip came to stand beside her, close enough that they might have been caught in an embrace if one did not look too closely, and Eleanor reached for his hand and found it as cold as her own. "We can stop this," Philip whispered, his grey eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, and Eleanor felt it there, the hesitation, the voice of her mother and her governess, and every lesson she had ever learned about propriety and duty, screaming at her to call this off before it was too late. But then she heard the front door open below, heard the murmur of servants greeting their master, heard the heavy footfall of a man she had married but never known beginning to climb the stairs toward the east wing where he never ventured, and she understood with sudden clarity that Frederick was coming to her chamber for the first time in 2 years, that something had already changed tonight before their scheme had even unfolded. Her hand tightened on Philip's as the footsteps grew closer, as the door handle began to turn, and Eleanor fixed her eyes on that widening gap of candlelight, with her heart in her throat, and her future balanced on the edge of a blade. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The door swung fully open at the stroke of midnight, and Frederick stood framed in the entrance, like a man carved from marble, his tall form rigid and his face a mask of such absolute stillness that Eleanor felt her heart stop beating entirely in that suspended moment before the world shattered around them. She saw him take in the scene with those dark eyes that had always looked through her rather than at her, saw them move from Philip in his shirt-sleeves to Eleanor in her nightgown with her hair tumbling loose around her shoulders, saw the precise instant when understanding crashed through his controlled facade like lightning splitting an ancient oak, and she watched something she had never witnessed in 3 years of marriage flicker across his features before he locked it away behind the cold aristocratic mask he wore like armor. Philip stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between Eleanor and her husband with a protective instinct that only made the scene appear more damning, and his voice when he spoke was steady, despite the impossible tension crackling through the candle-lit chamber. "Frederick, this is not what it appears," Philip began, but the Duke raised one gloved hand in a gesture of such imperious command that the words died unfinished in the air between them, and Eleanor noticed with strange clarity that he had removed only one glove, the other still encasing his left hand, as though he had been in too great a hurry to complete even this simple task. The candle flame guttered wildly in the draught from the open door, sending shadows dancing across the walls like witnesses to her disgrace, and Eleanor found herself rising from the bed on trembling legs, found herself moving toward her husband, even as every instinct screamed at her to flee or hide or dissolve into the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She stopped an arm's length away and looked up into the face of the man she had married but never known, the man who had shared her name but never her heart, and she saw beneath his rigid control something that stole the breath from her lungs and rewrote everything she had believed about this cold and distant stranger. There was pain there, genuine and raw and utterly unexpected, a wound opening behind his eyes that he could not quite conceal quickly enough. And Eleanor understood in that devastating moment that she had succeeded beyond her wildest imaginings, but in a way she had never anticipated. "Now you know how it feels," she whispered, the words emerging soft as snowfall, but landing with the force of a cannon shot in the terrible silence of the room, and she watched Frederick flinch as though she had struck him across the face with her open palm. The perfume she had expected, Lady Montague's signature jasmine and rose, was absent from his evening clothes, and instead Eleanor breathed in only rain and cold night air, and something uniquely him. And this detail lodged itself in her mind, even as her husband turned without a word and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like the final notes of a funeral dirge. The study was dark, save for the dying embers in the hearth, when Frederick finally stopped pacing and allowed himself to sink into the leather chair behind his desk, his hands trembling so violently that the brandy sloshed over the rim of the crystal glass and splashed onto papers he could not bring himself to care about, documents and correspondence that had seemed so vital mere hours ago, but now held no more significance than ash scattered on the wind. He had ordered Philip Sinclair from his house with words so cold and measured that they had surprised even himself, had watched the Earl gather his coat and cravat and bow stiffly before departing into the night without a single word of defense or explanation, and Frederick had felt something twist in his chest that he refused to examine too closely as the front door closed behind his rival with a finality that echoed through the silent halls. Rival, he thought bitterly, turning the word over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by endless handling. And when had he earned the right to consider any man a rival for Eleanor's affections when he had done nothing in 3 years to claim those affections for himself? The brandy burned a path down his throat, but did nothing to warm the frozen wasteland that had spread through his chest since the moment he had opened that bedchamber door and seen his wife in her nightgown, with her dark hair tumbling loose around her shoulders like a waterfall he had never been permitted to touch. He had returned early tonight, earlier than he had in months, because Lady Montague's drawing-room had felt suffocating in its perfumed emptiness, and her conversation had grated against his nerves like sandpaper, and he had found himself making excuses and calling for his carriage before the clock struck 10, driven by an impulse he could not name to return to the cold and silent house where his wife existed like a ghost he passed in corridors without acknowledgement. "Now you know how it feels," she had whispered, and those 6 words had struck him with more force than any blow he had ever received, had cracked open the careful armor he had spent 32 years constructing and exposed something raw and bleeding beneath. His hand moved without conscious thought to the bottom drawer of his desk, and he withdrew the small leather case he kept hidden there, opening it to reveal the miniature portrait of Eleanor that had been painted during their engagement, back when her eyes still held light and her smile still reached beyond the polite curve of her lips, back before he had systematically extinguished every flame of hope she had carried into this marriage. The artist had captured something in her expression that Frederick had not appreciated then, but recognized now with devastating clarity as trust, as the innocent belief that the man she was being given to would cherish and protect her, and he had betrayed that trust so thoroughly that she had been driven to stage a scene of infidelity simply to provoke some response from him. His rain-spotted coat lay crumpled over the chair where he had thrown it, and the fire continued to die without his summoning a servant to tend it, and Frederick sat alone in the gathering cold, with his wife's painted eyes watching him from across 3 years of silence and neglect. The grey light of morning crept through the windows of Ravenscroft House like an unwelcome visitor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the cold air and casting long shadows across the floors that Eleanor had paced throughout the endless night. And she stood now before her mirror in the plainest grey dress she owned, the same dress Frederick had once remarked suited her colouring during their first month of marriage, before silence had descended between them like a permanent winter. And she wondered if she had chosen it deliberately as armour, or as a reminder of a time when he had still bothered to look at her at all. Her reflection showed a woman who had not slept, whose eyes were rimmed with shadows dark as bruises, and whose hands trembled slightly as she fastened her grandmother's pearl earrings with fingers that felt clumsy and foreign. And she knew that somewhere in this vast and echoing house her husband sat equally sleepless, equally uncertain, and the knowledge that they were both suffering brought her no comfort whatsoever. The servants had begun to whisper. She could hear it in the careful way they avoided her gaze, and the hushed conversations that died abruptly whenever she entered a room. And Eleanor found she lacked the energy to care what they thought, or what gossip would spread through London's drawing rooms in the coming weeks. She had descended the stairs with her spine straight and her chin lifted, prepared to face Frederick across the breakfast table and accept whatever judgment he chose to deliver, only to find the dining room empty, save for a single place setting and a pot of tea gone cold, and she had stood there in the doorway feeling foolish and small until the sound of carriage wheels on gravel had drawn her attention to the window. The coach that pulled up to the entrance was familiar, painted in the soft blue that marked her family's estate, and Eleanor felt her heart lurch painfully as she recognized the figure that emerged with an armful of hothouse roses wrapped in brown paper, her younger sister Charlotte, with her bright smile and her innocent unawareness of the catastrophe into which she was stepping. Eleanor had forgotten the letter she had sent a week ago, the invitation extended during a moment of particular loneliness when she had craved any connection to her former life. And now Charlotte was here expecting a pleasant sisterly visit, while the ashes of Eleanor's marriage smouldered around them both. The front door opened, and Charlotte's voice rang through the entrance hall with all the warmth and light that had been absent from this house for 3 years, and Eleanor hurried to greet her, even as she heard another door open somewhere deeper in the house, heard the heavy footsteps that could only belong to Frederick, descending from whatever room he had spent the night, destroying himself in. And she turned to see him emerge into the morning light, looking like a man who had aged a decade in a single night, unshaven and hollow-eyed, and still wearing his evening clothes from the night before, and Charlotte's cheerful greeting died on her lips as she looked between her sister and her brother-in-law, and sensed immediately that she had walked into something far more complicated than a simple family visit. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the clouds as Eleanor guided Charlotte through the winter garden, their boots crunching on the gravel paths that wound between dormant rose bushes and skeletal hedgerows, and she found herself grateful for her sister's ceaseless chatter about the upcoming London season and the dresses she planned to commission, and the gentleman she hoped would request her hand for dances, because Charlotte's innocent prattle required nothing more than occasional murmurs of acknowledgement and allowed Eleanor to retreat into the exhausted numbness that had settled over her like a shroud since the previous night's catastrophe. She could feel Frederick's gaze upon her from somewhere in the house, could sense it like a physical weight between her shoulder blades, and when she glanced up toward his study window, she caught the movement of a figure stepping back from the glass, confirming what she had suspected all morning, that her husband was watching her with the same intensity he had never bothered to display during 3 years of marriage. Inside the house, in a room Eleanor could not see, Thomas Greville had arrived in response to a hastily scrawled note and stood now regarding his oldest friend with an expression of barely concealed alarm, taking in the unshaven jaw and the rumpled evening clothes and the empty brandy decanter on the desk with its damning evidence of a night spent in liquid oblivion. "So, look like death warmed over," Thomas said bluntly, and Frederick merely gestured toward the chair opposite, with a hand that still trembled slightly from exhaustion and alcohol, and something else he could not name. The story emerged in fragments, in halting sentences that cost Frederick more than he would ever admit, the midnight discovery, and Eleanor's whispered accusation, and the Earl of Sinclair departing into the night with his honour apparently intact, while Frederick's world crumbled around him like a house built on sand. Thomas listened without interruption until Frederick fell silent, and then he asked the question that struck like a blade to the chest. "Did you ever tell her you loved her, Frederick? Did you ever once in 3 years give her any reason to believe she was more than a transaction, more than a dowry and a duty and a body to produce your heirs?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and Frederick turned toward the window where he could see Eleanor in the garden below, her grey dress a smudge of colour against the brown winter landscape, her head inclined toward her sister as if she had not a care in the world, and he knew with devastating clarity that every mask she wore was one he had forced her to craft for survival. "I was a coward," he said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest, where he had buried everything soft and vulnerable years ago. "I told myself I was protecting us both from the weakness of attachment, that a cold marriage was safer than a passionate one, that if I never let her close, she could never destroy me the way my mother destroyed my father, and instead, I destroyed her so thoroughly that she sought comfort in the arms of another man." Thomas rose and stood beside him at the window, watching the two sisters disappear around a hedgerow. "Then talk to her," he said simply. "Before you make any decisions about annulments or separations or calling Sinclair out, talk to your wife. You owe her that much. And frankly, Frederick, you owe yourself the truth of what went wrong before you throw away whatever chance remains to salvage something from this wreckage." The drawing-room had been transformed by the fire burning high in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls and filling the space with a warmth that Eleanor could not remember feeling in this house since the earliest days of her marriage. And she sat in the chair nearest the hearth, with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating so violently she was certain Frederick must be able to hear it from where he stood by the window, his back to her, as he gathered whatever courage or words he needed for the conversation they had both been avoiding for 2 days, while Charlotte's innocent presence provided excuse after excuse for delay. Charlotte had been convinced to retire early with a headache powder and a promise of shopping in the village tomorrow, and now the house felt too quiet, too intimate. The clock on the mantel chiming 8 o'clock, with a sound that seemed to echo through Eleanor's bones as Frederick finally turned to face her with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something raw and uncertain that made him look younger than his 32 years and far more human than the cold statue she had married. "Why?" he asked, and the single word hung in the air between them like smoke. And Eleanor found that all the speeches she had prepared, all the accusations and justifications and bitter truths, dissolved on her tongue and left her with nothing but the simple, devastating honesty she had been running from for 3 years. "Because I wanted you to feel something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because in 3 years of marriage, you have never once looked at me the way you looked at me in that doorway, and I was so desperate to know that I existed to you that I was willing to destroy everything just to see pain in your eyes, just to know that I mattered enough to hurt you." Frederick's jaw tightened, and she watched the familiar mask try to settle over his features, watched him fight the instinct to retreat into coldness. And then something remarkable happened. The mask cracked and fell away, and he crossed the room to stand before her, with his hands clenched at his sides and his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "And Lady Montague?" Eleanor continued before he could speak, her courage growing now that she had begun. "Every dinner, every evening you spent at her estate, while I sat alone in this cold house, wondering what she had that I lacked, wondering if you whispered to her the words you never said to me." Frederick made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so bitter, and he sank into the chair across from her as though his legs could no longer support the weight of the truth he was about to speak. "I never bedded Georgiana Montague," he said, and the words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Eleanor thought she knew. "I never wanted her, never loved her, never gave her anything more than my company at dinner and the occasional dance at assemblies. She was armor, Eleanor, a shield I hid behind because I was too much a coward to face what I felt for you. And I let you believe the worst because it was easier than admitting that I was terrified of becoming my father, terrified of loving someone so much that their indifference could destroy me." The clock chimed 10, and neither of them moved to acknowledge it, suspended in this strange new space they had carved out between accusation and confession. And Eleanor found herself leaning forward in her chair as Frederick continued speaking in that rough, unfamiliar voice that bore no resemblance to the cold, measured tones she had endured for 3 years, telling her about his father and mother, and the marriage that had shaped his understanding of love as a weapon rather than a gift. "My father loved my mother with a devotion that bordered on madness," Frederick said, his eyes fixed on the dying fire rather than on Eleanor's face, "and she used that love to destroy him piece by piece, taking lovers and flaunting them, spending his fortune on her pleasures, laughing at his pain until he became a shadow of himself who died alone in this very house while she danced at a ball in London with her latest conquest." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built against him developing cracks she could not repair, because she had never known this, had never been told anything about the late Duke and Duchess beyond the bare facts of their existence and deaths. And suddenly, the cold, distant man she had married began to make a terrible kind of sense. "I swore I would never be my father," Frederick continued. "And when I found myself thinking about you too often, wanting to be near you, noticing the way you laughed or the honey you put in your tea or the pearl earrings you wore on our wedding day, I panicked and withdrew because I thought distance would protect us both from the poison I had watched destroy my parents." The fire crackled and settled, sending up a small shower of sparks, and Eleanor realized that her hand had moved across the settee cushion to rest mere inches from Frederick's, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin without touching him. "I thought you despised me," she said softly, her own confession emerging now that he had offered his. "I thought I was nothing more than a dowry and a duty, a body to produce heirs you never even tried to create. And when the servants whispered about Lady Montague, I believed every word because it was easier than admitting that my own husband found me so repulsive he could not bear to share my bed." Frederick made a sound of such profound anguish that Eleanor's hand closed the distance without her permission, her fingers brushing against his knuckles in a touch so light it might have been imagined. And he turned his hand palm upward in silent invitation, letting her fingers settle against his as they sat together in the firelight, grieving the 3 years they had wasted building walls against each other. "Philip saved me," Eleanor whispered, and she felt Frederick's hand tense beneath hers, but she pressed on because the truth demanded speaking. "He wrote to me and visited when propriety allowed, and reminded me that I was a person worthy of friendship and kindness, and I let you believe the worst about us because I wanted you to hurt the way I hurt." "I know," Frederick said, and his fingers curled around hers, tentative and uncertain. "I know, and I am sorrier than I can ever express for driving you to such desperation, for making you feel so invisible in your own home that destruction seemed preferable to continued silence." The morning of March 18th arrived with an unexpected gentleness, sunlight streaming through windows that had known only grey skies for weeks, and Eleanor woke from the first true sleep she had experienced in days to find the world transformed by a premature thaw that sent water dripping from the eaves and turned the frost on the garden into glittering diamonds that caught the light and threw it back in tiny rainbows, and she lay in her bed for a long moment, trying to reconcile the warmth filtering through the curtains with the cold that had lived in her heart for so long, uncertain whether the conversation of the previous evening had been real or merely another dream born of desperate longing. But the tenderness in her fingers where Frederick had held them told her it had happened, that they had sat together until nearly midnight, speaking truths that should have been spoken years ago. And when she finally rose and dressed and made her way down to the breakfast room, she found something that stopped her in the doorway with her hand pressed to her chest, for Frederick sat not at his usual place at the head of the long table, but at the seat directly beside her own. And he rose when she entered, with an uncertainty in his movements that she had never seen before, as though he too was navigating unfamiliar waters and feared at any moment the current might sweep him away. "I thought perhaps we might breakfast together," he said, and his voice held none of the cold formality she had grown accustomed to, only a hesitant hope that made him seem almost boyish, despite the lines of sleeplessness around his eyes. And Eleanor found herself nodding and taking her seat, and watching in wonder as he poured her tea himself rather than waiting for the footman, adding honey without being asked because he had remembered, he had noticed, he had stored away this small detail about her preferences and kept it somewhere in the vast architecture of his mind where she had believed no space existed for her at all. Charlotte appeared in the doorway moments later, and Eleanor watched her sister's eyes widen at the sight of the Duke of Ravenswood sitting at his wife's elbow like a suitor at a country assembly, and Charlotte's delighted smile as she took her own seat across from them felt like the first warm breeze of spring itself, and throughout the meal Frederick asked Eleanor questions she had never expected to hear from his lips, questions about her childhood and her favorite books, and whether she preferred walking in gardens or riding through fields, and she answered haltingly at first, and then with growing warmth as she realized he was genuinely listening, his grey eyes focused on her face with an attention that made her feel seen for the first time since she had walked down the aisle toward him 3 years ago. Charlotte excused herself after the meal with a knowing glance that made Eleanor blush, and in the silence that followed, Frederick reached across the table and touched the vase of hothouse roses that Charlotte had brought from their mother's garden, and when he looked up at Eleanor, there was something in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. The week that followed their first breakfast, together passed in a series of small revelations that Eleanor gathered like precious stones, examining each one in the privacy of her heart before allowing herself to believe in their reality, for Frederick continued his campaign of quiet courtship with a determination that both touched and terrified her, joining her for meals and walks through the awakening gardens and conversations that stretched into the evening hours, and by March 22nd, the true spring had emerged to replace the false thaw, crocuses pushing through the softened earth, and birdsong returning to the trees that lined the drive, and Eleanor found herself standing at the drawing-room window watching Frederick discuss something with the head gardener, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel made her turn, and her blood ran cold as she recognized the elegant barouche that had haunted her imagination for 3 years, the gilded crest on its door belonging to none other than Lady Georgiana Montague. And before Eleanor could move or speak or flee, the footman was announcing the visitor, and Lady Montague herself was sweeping into the drawing-room in a cloud of that familiar perfume, the scent that Eleanor had learned to associate with her husband's betrayal, jasmine and something darker beneath it. And the widow's eyes found Eleanor with a flash of surprise that quickly transformed into something like amusement as she said she had not expected to find the Duchess at home. She had assumed Eleanor would be occupied elsewhere as usual, and Eleanor felt every wall she had begun to lower rising again, brick by brick, until Frederick appeared in the doorway behind Lady Montague, and the expression on his face stopped Eleanor's retreat, for there was no warmth in his eyes as he regarded his former companion. No flicker of the desire Eleanor had always imagined burned between them, only a cool displeasure that tightened his jaw as he stepped past Lady Montague to stand at Eleanor's side, closer than he had yet dared, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the thin muslin of her spring dress. "Lady Montague," Frederick said, and his voice held none of the velvet Eleanor remembered from the early days of their marriage, only frost. "I believe I made my position clear in my last letter, and when the widow began to protest that she had merely called to inquire after his health, he cut her off with a raised hand, and words that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, words spoken not to Lady Montague, but to Eleanor herself as he turned to face his wife, with something burning in his grey eyes that she had never seen before. "I have spent 3 years hiding behind this woman," Frederick said, using her reputation and her willingness to play along as a shield against feeling anything for the wife I was too cowardly to love. "And I am finished with hiding, finished with pretending, Finished with allowing anyone, including myself, to treat you as anything less than the centre of this household, and my heart." Lady Montague departed in offended silence, her perfume lingering like a ghost being exorcised, and Eleanor stood trembling in the drawing-room, unable to speak. As Frederick remained beside her, not touching, but present, choosing her at last. The evening of March 25th arrived draped in golden light, the first truly warm evening of the season, and Eleanor sat at the writing desk in her private sitting-room with the windows thrown open to admit the soft breeze that carried the scent of early blossoms and the promise of summer still months away, and she was reading a letter that had arrived that afternoon, a letter written in a familiar hand that made her heart clench with a complicated mixture of guilt and gratitude and sorrow. For Philip Sinclair had written to inquire after her well-being with all the gentle concern that had characterized their friendship since childhood, and she did not hear Frederick enter until his shadow fell across the page, and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway with an expression she could not quite decipher. Something caught between hope and pain as his eyes moved from her face to the letter in her hands, and recognition flickered across his features, and the silence that stretched between them felt heavy with all the words that had not yet been spoken about that night, about Philip, about the staged betrayal that had shattered everything, and somehow led them here to this tentative new beginning. "You have heard from Lord Sinclair," Frederick said, and his voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and she realized with a start that he was jealous, that beneath the composed exterior of the Duke of Ravenswood there burned a fire she had never suspected, and instead of frightening her, this knowledge sent warmth flooding through her chest, because jealousy required caring, and caring was something she had believed him incapable of for so long. "I must tell you the truth," Eleanor said, rising from her chair and crossing the room to stand before him, closer than she had dared since their marriage began, close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly in his throat. And she told him everything, the words spilling out like water released from a dam, how nothing had happened between her and Philip that night, how the entire scene had been staged, how she had been so desperate to make Frederick feel something, anything, even if it was only rage, that she had orchestrated her own apparent ruin. And as she spoke, she watched his face transform from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like wonder. And when she finished, he stood in silence for a long moment before reaching out and taking her hand in his, the first deliberate touch he had initiated since their courtship began anew, his fingers warm and slightly trembling as they intertwined with hers. "You risked everything," Frederick said, his voice rough with emotion. "You risked your reputation, your place in society, your very future, just to make me see you." And Eleanor nodded because there were no words adequate to explain the depth of loneliness that had driven her to such desperate measures. And Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that burned like a brand and whispered against her skin, "I see you now, Eleanor. I see you, and I swear I will never look away again." The days that followed Frederick's whispered promise unfolded like the petals of Charlotte's hothouse roses, slowly revealing colors Eleanor had never dared imagine existed within the grey walls of Ravenscroft House. And by March 28th, she found herself standing in the library at twilight, a room she had rarely entered during her 3 years as Duchess, because Frederick had always claimed it as his sanctuary, his retreat from the world and from her. But now he had invited her here to see the collection of botanical illustrations he had mentioned over breakfast, and as she turned the pages of the leather-bound volume, he stood close behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. And when she paused at a watercolor of wild roses, he reached past her to touch the page, and his arm brushed against hers, and neither of them moved away, and Eleanor felt something shift in the air between them, a charge like the atmosphere before a summer storm, and when she turned to look up at him, his grey eyes were dark with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize, an emotion that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken in ways she had long ago stopped hoping to feel. "I have been thinking," Frederick said, his voice low and rough in a way that sent shivers down her spine, about all the things I should have done, and all the words I should have said, and all the moments I let slip away because I was too afraid to reach for them. And Eleanor could not speak, could only stand there trembling as he lifted his hand and touched her face for the first time, his fingertips tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. And he said, "I should have told you on our wedding night that you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I should have told you every morning for 3 years that waking in a house that contained you was the greatest gift I had ever been given. I should have held you when you cried and laughed with you, when you smiled and learned every corner of your heart instead of hiding from my own." And Eleanor felt the tears spill over as he cupped her face in both hands and looked at her with an intensity that burned away the last of her defenses. And when he asked if he might kiss her, she could only nod because words had abandoned her entirely. And then his lips met hers in a kiss that was nothing like the perfunctory brush he had bestowed on their wedding day. This kiss was fire and promise and 3 years of suppressed longing finally released, and Eleanor melted into him as his arms came around her and held her against his heart, and she thought that this must be what it felt like to come home after wandering lost in the wilderness, this warmth, this belonging, this fierce and tender claiming that left no doubt she was wanted, cherished, loved at last. The days that followed their first kiss seemed to Eleanor like pages torn from someone else's story, a story she had once read and longed for but never believed could be her own. And now, on the evening of March 30th, she found herself seated before the mirror in her bedchamber, while her maid brushed out her hair, and she watched her own reflection with something like wonder, because the woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed ghost who had haunted these rooms for 3 years. This woman had colour in her cheeks and light in her eyes, and a softness about her mouth that came from being kissed thoroughly, and often by a husband who seemed determined to make up for every moment of tenderness he had denied her. And when the maid finished and withdrew, Eleanor remained seated, running her fingers through the loose waves of her hair, and remembering how Frederick had buried his hands in it just that afternoon in the garden, how he had pulled her behind the ancient oak tree and kissed her until she was breathless and laughing and had to push him away before the gardeners saw. And she was still smiling at the memory when she heard the connecting door between their chambers open for the first time since their wedding night, a door that had remained locked and silent for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. And she turned to find Frederick standing in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves, his cravat undone, his hair dishevelled, looking at her with an expression that made her heart stop, and then race wildly. And he said her name in a voice she had never heard him use before, low and rough and full of longing. And Eleanor rose from her chair and went to him, because there was nowhere else she wanted to be, and when he reached for her, she stepped into his arms as naturally as breathing, and lifted her face for his kiss. And this kiss was different from all the others, deeper and more urgent, carrying within it a question she understood without words. And when he drew back to look at her, his grey eyes dark with desire, and something softer, something that looked like reverence, he asked if she would have him, truly have him, not as a duty or an obligation, but as a wife who wanted her husband. And Eleanor answered by taking his hand and leading him toward the bed she had slept in alone for 3 years. And later, much later, when they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender, and something new, something that was uniquely them, Frederick traced patterns on her bare shoulder and told her he loved her, the words falling from his lips like a confession too long held back. And Eleanor wept because she had waited so long to hear them and had believed she never would, and Frederick kissed away her tears and promised her a lifetime of those words spoken every morning and every evening until she grew tired of hearing them, and Eleanor laughed through her tears and told him she would never tire of it, never. And outside the window the spring moon rose over Ravenscroft House and illuminated a marriage, finally, truly begun. The morning of April 2nd, 1814, dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that seemed to promise. That winter's grip had finally loosened its hold on the English countryside, and Eleanor woke to find herself alone in the great bed she now shared with her husband, the sheets beside her still warm from his body, and she stretched luxuriously in the golden light that streamed through the windows and thought about how different everything had become in the span of just a few weeks, how the cold and silent house had transformed into something warm and alive, how the man she had believed incapable of love had revealed himself to be capable of such tenderness that it sometimes overwhelmed her, and she was still lying there lost in contemplation when the door opened and Frederick entered, carrying a breakfast tray himself rather than sending a servant, and the sight of the Duke of Ravenswood in his shirt-sleeves balancing tea and toast made her laugh with a joy she had not known she possessed. And he smiled at her laughter, that rare smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish, and he said he had wanted to bring her breakfast in bed because he had realized he had never done so, and there were so many things he had never done that he intended to do now. And Eleanor sat up against the pillows and watched him arrange the tray across her lap with careful concentration, and when he settled beside her on the bed and stole a piece of her toast, she swatted his hand away with mock indignation, and he caught her fingers and kissed them one by one, and she thought her heart might burst from the simple sweetness of this moment, this ordinary morning ritual that felt like the most extraordinary gift she had ever received. And later that afternoon Charlotte found them in the garden, Frederick showing Eleanor the roses he had ordered planted in her favourite colour, a deep crimson that reminded her of the flowers her mother grew, and Charlotte clasped her hands together and declared that she had never seen two people more perfectly suited. And Eleanor caught Frederick's eye and saw him suppress a smile at the irony of Charlotte's words. For if only her sister knew how close they had come to destroying everything, how near Eleanor had been to losing this man she was only now beginning to truly know. And that evening after Charlotte had retired, Eleanor sat with Frederick in the library that had become their sanctuary, her head resting against his shoulder as he read aloud from a volume of poetry, his deep voice wrapping around the words like velvet, and she closed her eyes and listened and felt tears prick behind her lids, because she had never imagined her life could contain such contentment. And when Frederick noticed her tears, he set aside the book and gathered her close and asked what troubled her, and she told him nothing troubled her, nothing at all. She was simply happy. The afternoon of April 5th, 1814, brought with it a letter that would alter the course of Eleanor's newfound happiness, and she received it in the morning room where she sat with Frederick reviewing the household accounts together, a task she had once performed alone in dreary isolation, but which had become one of their small shared rituals. And when the butler presented the silver tray bearing the sealed missive, she recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, and felt a flutter of anxiety because correspondence from Lady Ashworth rarely brought pleasant news, and Frederick noticed her hesitation and reached across to cover her hand with his own, a gesture so natural now that Eleanor marveled at how foreign it would have seemed mere weeks ago, and she broke the seal and read in silence while Frederick waited with the patience he had cultivated in these new days of their marriage. And when she finished, she looked up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears, and he asked what troubled her without demanding, simply offering his attention as a gift she could accept or decline. And Eleanor told him that her mother wrote of their marriage, of rumours that had reached the countryside about that terrible night, whispers that painted Eleanor as an adulteress and Frederick as a cuckolded fool. And she watched his face carefully for signs of the old coldness, the withdrawal she had learned to expect whenever anything threatened his pride, but instead she saw only concern for her, and he asked what she wished to do, and Eleanor realized with a start that no one had ever asked her that question before, not her mother who had arranged her marriage, not her father who had signed the contracts, not even Philip who had loved her in his gentle way but had never fought for her choices, and she told Frederick that she wished to face it directly, to attend the spring ball at Almack's as his wife, on his arm, and let the ton see for themselves that the Duke of Ravenswood stood with his Duchess, and Frederick smiled that rare smile that still made her breath catch, and said he would be honoured to stand with her against any storm, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling that she had not even known still stood, because here at last was the partnership she had dreamed of in those lonely years. Here was a husband who saw her not as a possession or an obligation, but as a person whose wishes mattered, whose battles he would fight alongside her rather than leaving her to face alone. And when he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, she understood that the scandal which had seemed so devastating might become the very thing that proved their love to the world. And she leaned across the scattered account books and kissed him properly, not caring that the door stood open or that servants might see, because she was the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and she had earned her place at last. The evening of April 10th, 1814 arrived with all the glittering promise and sharp danger of a blade held to the throat, and Eleanor stood before her mirror in the grandest gown she had ever worn, a confection of deep emerald silk that Frederick had commissioned from the finest modiste in London, the bodice embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the candlelight like scattered stars, and she hardly recognized the woman who gazed back at her with eyes that held both fear and fierce determination. For this was not the grey shadow who had haunted the East Wing for 3 long years. This was the Duchess of Ravenscroft preparing to face the wolves of the Tun with her husband at her side. And when Frederick appeared in the doorway of her chamber, wearing his finest evening clothes, his dark hair swept back, and his cravat tied to perfection, he stopped mid-step and simply stared at her with an expression that made her cheeks flush with warmth, and he said she was magnificent, and that every person at Almack's would see what a fool he had been to ever look elsewhere. And Eleanor felt tears threaten, but blinked them back, because tonight was not for weeping, but for triumph. And as they descended the grand staircase together, Charlotte clapped her hands and declared them the handsomest couple in all of England, and even the servants who had witnessed so much coldness in this house smiled to see their master and mistress united at last, and the carriage ride through the London streets passed in comfortable silence, Frederick's gloved hand holding Eleanor's firmly, as if he feared she might vanish. And when they arrived at the hallowed assembly rooms, Eleanor could feel the weight of 100 gaze turning toward them, could hear the whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. But Frederick tucked her hand more securely into the crook of his arm and walked forward with the unshakable confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. And the patronesses watched with sharp eyes as the Duke of Ravenscroft led his wife onto the dance floor for the first waltz, and Eleanor felt the room spinning around her, but Frederick's steady presence anchored her, his hand warm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers as they moved through the steps she had practiced alone in her cold chamber during all those lonely nights. And when the music swelled, he pulled her slightly closer than was strictly proper, and murmured against her hair that he was proud of her, that she was braver than any soldier he had ever known. And Eleanor laughed despite herself, because the compliment was so unexpected and so perfectly him, this man who showed his love in such peculiar ways. And when the dance ended and the applause scattered around them, she saw something shift in the faces of those who watched, saw the whispers change from scandal to speculation to something that looked almost like admiration, because the Tun respected nothing so much as a couple who refused to be defeated by gossip. The days following the Almack's triumph unfolded like the petals of Charlotte's hothouse roses, each one revealing new layers of color and warmth that Eleanor had never dared to imagine possible. And on the morning of April 15th, 1814, she woke to find Frederick already gone from their bed, but a single white rose resting on his pillow, with a note written in his precise hand that simply said he would return by luncheon and that he had a surprise for her. And Eleanor pressed the rose to her lips and marveled at how completely her world had transformed in the span of a single month, how the man who had once been a stranger sharing her roof had become the center of her every waking thought and the comfort of her sleeping hours. And when Charlotte bounded into her chamber, demanding to know what had Eleanor, smiling so foolishly, Eleanor found herself laughing without restraint and sharing the note with her sister, who squealed with delight and declared that Frederick had become positively romantic, which was not a word anyone in the Tun would have associated with the cold Duke of Ravenscroft before this spring. And the hours until luncheon stretched interminably as Eleanor tried to occupy herself with correspondence and household matters, but found her gaze drifting constantly to the window that overlooked the drive. And when at last she heard the clatter of hooves and the rumble of carriage wheels, she had to restrain herself from running to the door like a child, and Frederick entered the morning room with that smile that still felt like a gift each time she witnessed it, and took her hand and led her outside, where a beautiful mare, the color of burnished copper, stood waiting with a blue ribbon braided into her mane, and Eleanor gasped because she had mentioned only once in passing during one of their long evening conversations that she had loved to ride as a girl, but had given it up when her father sold her horse to pay gambling debts. And Frederick said he remembered every word she had ever spoken to him now, and intended to spend the rest of his life making up for all the words he had failed to hear before. And Eleanor wept then, not from sorrow, but from a joy so overwhelming it could not be contained. And Frederick held her against his chest, and stroked her hair, and let her tears soak into his waistcoat, without a word of complaint. And Charlotte watched from the doorway with her hand pressed to her heart, and later wrote to their mother that Eleanor had found happiness at last, and that the Duke was not at all the cold man reputation had painted him. And that afternoon Eleanor rode her new mare through the park with Frederick beside her once. His grey stallion and the ton watched and whispered, but this time the whispers carried notes of wonder rather than scandal, because the transformation of the Ravenscroft marriage had become the most romantic story of the season, and Eleanor thought that perhaps the pain of those 3 lost years had been necessary to bring them to this place of perfect understanding. The morning of April 20th, 1814, dawned with the soft golden light of true spring at last, and Eleanor woke to find Frederick propped on one elbow beside her, watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that her heart contracted with a sweetness almost painful in its intensity. And when she asked him what he was thinking, he said he was memorizing her face in this light, because he had wasted 3 years of mornings that should have been spent exactly thus, and he intended to make up for every single one. And Eleanor reached up to trace the line of his jaw, now familiar to her fingertips, and marveled at how this man who had once seemed carved from marble had become warm flesh and beating heart beneath her hands. And they lay together in the quiet of the morning, while the household stirred below them, and the birds sang outside the windows, that Eleanor had ordered opened to let in the spring air, and when at last they descended to breakfast, Charlotte was already there with the letter clutched in her hands and tears streaming down her cheeks. And Eleanor's heart seized with fear until Charlotte thrust the letter toward her, and Eleanor saw that the tears were of joy, because their mother had written to say she was coming to London for the first time in years, drawn by Charlotte's glowing reports of Eleanor's transformation and the Duke's reformation. And Eleanor felt her own eyes fill because she had not seen her mother since the wedding day, when Lady Ashworth had pressed her hand and whispered that she was sorry. But there was no other choice. And now she would see her daughter not as a sacrifice to duty, but as a woman loved and cherished by the man fate had chosen for her. And Frederick watched Eleanor's face as she read and reread the letter, and then quietly excused himself. And when he returned an hour later, he presented Eleanor with a stack of invitations he had personally written to the finest dressmakers and milliners in London, explaining that her mother must be properly outfitted for the season, and that all expenses would be charged to his accounts. And Eleanor stared at him, and then at the invitations, and then burst into tears that took both Frederick and Charlotte by surprise. But when Frederick gathered her against his chest and asked what was wrong, Eleanor could only shake her head and say that nothing was wrong, that everything was finally wonderfully, impossibly right, and that she loved him more than she had words to express. And Frederick kissed her hair and held her until the storm of emotion passed, and Charlotte dabbed at her own eyes and declared that she had never seen a more perfect couple in all her life, which was saying something because she had read every romantic novel in their mother's library twice over. And Eleanor laughed through her tears, and Frederick smiled that smile that still felt like sunrise after endless winter, and the 3 of them sat down to breakfast together as a family.